All right. Hi, everyone. My name is Katie Lamke. I grew up in California. I went to Humboldt State and then ended up chasing bees out in North Dakota and Nebraska. And I have not been able to leave the Midwest Great Plains area yet. So I am a conservation biologist with Xerces as well, focused on running the Bumble Bee Atlas program here in North Dakota, South Dakota, Nebraska, Kansas, Iowa, Missouri, Minnesota. And we've got lots of wonderful colleagues and partners out here that help make that project function. My interests sort of spiked with bee identification and learning all about the intricacies that wild bees can showcase between their colors and some of the punctures and fine hairs and all of that. So I ended up getting my master's looking at the relationship between tallgrass prairie remnants and restorations and how wild bee communities vary between those ecosystems. So I'm happy to join you all tonight and get to interact with some of the California volunteers.
All right, thank you. Well, let's get started. I'm going to share my screen. As I said, there will be three separate modules. This is the first one. It's an introduction to bumblebees, what they are, what a bee is, sort of technically speaking, how they live, and some of the information about declines and things like this. After this, I will turn it over to Katie. Let's skip that slide. Um, um, so first, I want to tell you just a little bit about the Xerces Society for Invertebrate Conservation. As the name suggests, we are focused on conserving wildlife through the conservation of invertebrates and their habitats. And we organize our work in 5 different programmatic areas. One is about native pollinators, another endangered species, and that's where the Bumblebee Atlas project lives at Xerces. And then aquatic invertebrates like mussels, butterfly conservation, especially monarchs, but definitely all of the other butterflies as well. And then a program on pesticides and how we can lessen our dependence on them. We are a science-based or evidence-based organization, so we make decisions, we send messages to you and others based on information and what's real in the world. I think that's worth just saying. And we do this work with a lot of different partners, academic partners, government researchers, community scientists such as you all, and so many other people. So this is science, and it involves lots of different partners. Community science, sometimes called citizen science, but of course it has nothing to do with citizenship, so we'll call it community science, is what we're here to talk about tonight. So we have at Xerces, we have a Bumblebee Atlas project in 20 different states, California just one of them, and Katie mentioned a few of those other states. We have Bumblebee Watch, which is the data management platform for the Bumblebee Atlas data, but it's also used by people who are not actually participating in the Atlas, who are just sending in an observation of a bumblebee. We have the Western Monarch Counts. We have Western Monarch Milkweed Mapper. We have a freshwater mussel survey, a firefly atlas, and we have more. So there's a link there to our community science programs. And this isn't the only good one. This isn't the only fun one. There's a lot of really cool stuff going on at Xerces around the country. And so I encourage you to get involved in some of those other things too. Now, we also do policy and advocacy work when the evidence warrants that we do so. So here's our executive director testifying before Congress, I think. And then we do lots of education and training, indoors and out, mainly in the US, but elsewhere as well. Training about pollinators, about other invertebrates and their conservation needs, and the links between people and insects, invertebrates. And we have conserved a lot of land on the ground. We don't buy land like the Nature Conservancy or another organization like that, but we do technical assistance and we help others to restore pollinator habitat, create pollinator habitat, make farms better habitat for these important animals. And we are a 501c3 nonprofit. And so we depend on donors and never more than this year. So if you're not a member and you want to become one, there is a link. And unfortunately, it's partly under that little charity navigator thing, but it's xerces.org/donate. And if you are a member, thank you so much for supporting the work that we're doing today. So as I said, there will be 3 different modules. This one is just 20 minutes, and then the meat of the thing is going to be presented by Katie, and that's going to be 70 minutes. We will then take a 5-minute break, And we'll spend a half an hour after that talking about identification of bumblebees. As I go through this, I will try to mention the names of bumblebees when I see them when I'm talking about a slide. These are Bombus bifarius. It's a common species in the mountains in California, and that's a queen and a worker caste bee. So why do we care about invertebrates? Why are we gathered here tonight to talk about bumblebees? Well, as you no doubt know, they're really important to the world, to the functioning of ecosystems, to human health, and in all sorts of other ways. So some of those ways, invertebrates are integral in decomposition, so nutrient cycling, turning poop back into soil and that sort of thing. They're important biocontrol agents in nature as well as on farms, where animals like wasps will use pest animals like aphids as their host for their eggs. They're obviously food for lots of other animals. And we like to highlight pollination, especially given that we're talking about bees tonight. So helping plants reproduce is this super important thing that bees and other insects do. Uh, More about that. This is a mutualism, right? Plants offer pollen and nectar, these food items, to visitors, and those visitors, let's say they're bees, are getting that food, and in exchange, they are moving pollen between female flowers or female flower parts and helping the plants actually produce seeds. So it's a back and forth, a mutualism. Um, in fact, pollinators are thought of as keystone species, meaning that they perform a role in the ecosystem that is integral, and without them, things would fall apart, and the way that different parts of the ecosystem interacted would be quite different. It's estimated that more than 85% of flowering land plants require animals, usually insects, for pollination. The vast majority of those pollinators are actually bees. And bees are critical also to the pollination of crops. About 10% of the total value of agriculture is due to that pollination activity. So another way of thinking about it is, if we didn't have bees, farmers would make only 90% as much money as they do now. Food would cost more. And it's important to understand that food would be really different. We wouldn't have as many fruits and vegetables and nutritious things that taste good. Uh, Surprisingly, until you get into this world, it is not honeybees that are doing the majority of this pollination work. It's actually wild bees. So think of that. We have thousands of different types of wild animals that are commuting to farms to get their own food. It's what they need, right? They're not doing it as an altruistic act. They're just going for their food. And then they're leaving the farm and going back to where they live. Maybe they live on the side of the farm. Maybe they live far away. But it's important to understand that despite the importance of honeybees as pollinators on farms, they're not doing the majority of that pollination. It's actually these bumblebees and their allies, like this halictus in this slide. So before we move on to bumblebees, let's not forget that there are other important groups of pollinators, things like butterflies and moths, flies, wasps, and even beetles. Of course, there's a bunch of other weird pollinators, vertebrates and other things. Bees, far and away, are the most important in a functional sense. Taken together, all of the bees, they do most of that work, the majority of that work. So, so when we're talking about bumblebees, we are talking about a functionally important group of animals in terms of them being pollinators. So why is that? Well, as I said earlier, they need nectar and pollen, and the only place to get those things is flowers, right? And they need that food for themselves, but mainly for their pollen, the protein source, mainly for raising their offspring. So they have to go to flowers, which means they end up dusted in pollen, and they're really good at passively moving it between flowers. They have all these adaptations to actually harvest that pollen and carry it. And I've circled one here in red, and that's the corbicula or pollen basket. More about that later. The shiny hairless area there with the overlapping bristles, that's where the pollen is carried. So they collect the pollen, they moisten it with some nectar, they pack it into that shiny hairless area, and those little hairs hold onto it, and then they fly home with it. So that's an adaptation that evolved through millions of years of bees feeding on pollen, right? They have a bunch of other cool adaptations too that we'll skip for now. And just, I always like to say to people, pollination by bees, it's incidental to their foraging behavior. It is not, again, an altruistic behavior. It's not this sort of mutualism where they're doing it on purpose to help the plant. It is absolutely just self-interested behavior. That doesn't make it any less cool or mutualism any less important, but I like people to understand that the terms of the interactions that we're talking about. This is a species that doesn't occur in California, Bombus turricola, a lovely bee from the east and the northern part of the continent. Just a word about honeybees. They are domesticated Eurasian bees of great import to agriculture. And again, they're not the most important pollinators taken at a global scale for farms. Unfortunately, they are broadly naturalized in North America, or another way to say it is they're invasive species. They live without the help of people, and they have a negative impact on some other things in the environment, including bumblebees. We have a lot of research that says that honeybees they compete with bumblebees for food, and they spread diseases to them. And so um, I don't want to make value judgments about these bees, but I do want you to understand that honeybees are quite a different animal than bumblebees. If this was a bird conservation community science atlas, I'd be using a chicken picture. This is the chicken of bees, okay? So think about it as a farm animal that has escaped. And I want you to just visually look at it so you get a sense of what a bumblebee is. It's generally larger than a honeybee. The honeybee on the left, the bumblebee on the right. And honeybees typically have these golden stripes on them, and sometimes black stripes as well. Globally, we have a lot of different types of bees. Honeybees are one type. We have many, many different types of bees. More than 20,000 species have been described. And in North America, I think that number is a little inflated, but it's about 5,000 species. And the US and Canada, just over 3,600 separate species of bees. California alone has more than 1,600 different species of native bees, a huge diversity. It's just so many different types of bees. And bumblebees are not very diverse. There are only 265 globally. And here in California, 25. And in North America, about 50. So not that many. It's a very different group. But these photos should give you a sense that bees are really diverse in what they look like, how hairy they are, how big they are, and the other things that follow from that, like their behavior and their ecology. So bumblebees are one thing we're going to get to know really well tonight and this summer, but there are many other types of bees. And I encourage you to look at the flowers at these other bees while you're collecting bumblebees. They're really fascinating. So bumblebees, they're the charismatic macrofauna of the bee world. They're big and beautiful and brightly colored. It makes them appealing objects of study. It's really fun to handle them, and they're just really cool animals, I think. I think you'll agree with me when you start getting into it. Let's talk a little bit about where they are. So this is a map of the species richness or diversity, biological diversity of bumblebees on the continent. I said there are about 50 of them. And in each of those cells, I've summed up the number of species that have been found in recorded history. And so you can see that the center of diversity is really the Rocky Mountains, the central Rockies, let's say, and then areas of the Pacific coast. Some of the other spots might have more species because of more collecting activity. And I'm gonna flip to another tile to show you collecting activity. That shows you the collecting activity. So of all the data we have for bumblebees, we just don't have very much in northern Canada or in much of Alaska. We have very little in parts of Texas. California is pretty well surveyed already. Look at the East Coast. This is the bias of lots of universities there, lots of entomologists there. Entomology getting going on the East Coast sooner than it did on the Pacific Coast. Things like this. So flipping back to the diversity map, you have to look at the collections map to kind of get a sense of where things are really diverse. And I wanted to just add that there is a one place in the Midwest that's really important in terms of diversity. The two dark green tiles you see there, one of them is overlapping the Black Hills. And we don't typically think of the Midwest as being this super diverse place for bumblebees, but the Black Hills of South Dakota, Nebraska, Western Nebraska, that's a place where the Western bumblebee fauna and the Eastern bumblebee fauna come together, and many of them are present at the same place at the same time. It's a really cool thing that happens on a continental scale. Okay, so let's talk a little about their ecology. These are social insects with an annual colony cycle. So they're insects that live in a family group and they cooperate to raise their offspring. That's the social part. There's lots of communication through touch, through behavior of all sorts, through chemistry. And we have a division of labor in a social insect society. So we have a queen who's doing all of the egg laying. We have workers who are females who generally don't make eggs, and they don't mate, and they do most of the labor of the colony. And we have males who go out and find mates and mate with them. And later in the summer, we have new queens who we also call gines or gynes, and they're produced towards the end of the summer, and they go out and find those males. So a division of labor, but everybody. So only two bees in a whole colony are actually undergoing sexual reproduction, but all of the other bees are closely related to those two, the mom and the dad. And so it's this thing called inclusive fitness. You want to participate in the family group because it helps your mom make more offspring that you're related to. That's how that evolved and how that works. It's a really cool thing in the insect world to see parental care for offspring. It's not uncommon, but it's a really big deal in social insects. And so here in the center photo, you can see a queen and her daughters on the comb, and they're tending to offspring. They're checking on pupa in those light-colored cases. They're opening and closing cases all day long to check on the status of their siblings. It's a really cool situation going on. A very cool family dynamic. Some of them are actually social parasites, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. I've talked about what they eat. It's important to understand they are generalists who eat many things. They eat hundreds, they eat thousands of different types of plants. So they can go to just about anything. Well, not just anything, but many types of plants, both native and non-native. Although they have a long evolutionary history with the native plants, and those are certainly the more important food sources for them. They have a lifespan of 3 to who knows how many weeks, and they're quite smart. They learn a lot. They learn to forage. They learn from watching each other. They get better at foraging as they go on. They get more efficient. So there's a bunch of cool science about how they think and how they orient and how they behave, how they accumulate memories and then use those memories to behave. So there's that. And the nests themselves are hard to observe. They're usually underground, usually in an abandoned rodent burrow, sometimes in other places like brush piles or bird nests in California. There's one species that loves bird nests, the bird house you have in your backyard, I mean. Sometimes in tree holes and other sorts of places like that. So the annual life cycle, this beautiful illustration is from the Midwest, and the bee in question here is the rusty-patched bumblebee, one of the federally listed endangered species. The climate's a little different, but nonetheless, this will help us understand from left to right, we'll go from spring to winter. So in springtime, the queen cast bee has been hibernating underground for anywhere from 1 to 9 months, depending on where on the continent she is. She comes out according to some temperature cues and starts to forage to feed herself and also to look for a nest site. When she's found that nest site, she starts bringing food back to it and provisioning it, as you see underground in that second tile there. After about a month to 6 weeks, those eggs that she first laid will become adult offspring. The first clutch of eggs, there's usually fewer than 10 of them, and they become worker caste. And now the workers do all of the labor out of the colony and in the colony, and the queen stays home and she eats and lays eggs. The colony grows sort of exponentially until at some point where they decide together that it is time to reproduce. And it's a complicated and fascinating story of how the queen and her daughters decide when it's time. And I'll skip it for now, but suffice to say, they make male offspring and they make a reproductive female offspring. Same egg as the worker egg, but it is destined to go a different way. It goes to become a gine or a queen. They go out of the nest, they eat, they find each other, they mate. That's what the mating looks like. And then the colony falls apart and dies, the males die, and the newly mated queens, just the newly mated ones, the new bees, will go and find a hole in the ground to overwinter in. So in fact, they don't find a hole, they dig it. And it's a shallow little trench, maybe 4 inches deep. They bury themselves and they go into diapause, which is a life stage where they're alive, they're metabolizing food resources, they're making waste, they're doing all the things a living animal does, but they're doing it very slowly and waiting until they can come out the next year and start a colony of their own. However, I want you to understand that the cycle, the timing of things, what we call phenology, is really different from year to year, especially in California, based on things like climate. Well, things about like weather, how much precipitation we get in winter affects when the plants start flowering, and affects when the queens come out of the ground from hibernation. And so here's 3 years of data for two species, Crotch's bumblebee and Vosnesensky bumblebee, and I've separated it by males and females. And I just want you to see the gross pattern. These are kernel density estimates. You don't have to worry about the Y or vertical axis. The X or horizontal axis is just the date. And so 2022 was a really different year for Crotch's bumblebee than 2023. And so when you interpret the material I just gave you about the annual cycle, you should think a little bit about the fact that things are complex. California has many varied climates, and things are different each year. This slide is a little bit cut off on my computer, and I hope it's not for you. This is about the life cycle of bumblebees. And so on the left here, we have that annual cycle again, and I've already presented it to you, going from upper left in a circle. This slide is meant to not talk about that again, but to tell you about cuckoo bumblebees, or these social parasites. So the bee in the photo is Bombus insularis. It's one that's it's the most common cuckoo bumblebee on the continent, I think, and it's common in the Sierra Nevadas, in the northern mountains. Sometimes there's some certain places in SoCal you can find them. These are not queens, they're females. If you notice, she does not have that shiny hairless area on her leg. It's actually a thicket of hairs. And so this is a bee that cannot carry pollen home. She can go eat it, but she cannot pick it up and drag it home to feed offspring. And that's because she has lost that structure through evolution, because she has a different strategy for reproducing. She enters the nest of another species. She uses a combination of aggression and pheromones to subjugate the queen and her daughters. She kills some of them, but usually she keeps most of them alive. And she kills all of the larvae and pupa and eggs, and then she lays her own. And the colony now just takes care of her offspring. And the colony will produce nothing but her reproductive females and male offspring. So, and the photo is from a European species that I found online, and that is a cuckoo bumblebee trying to get into a nest box where a non-cuckoo bumblebee lives. So it's a super fascinating part of the life of these bees. It's important to understand that the cuckoo bumblebees, sometimes called Xerces, I think, yeah, there. Xerces with a P. They are bumblebees. 100 years ago, scientists thought they were something else. They were some other kind of bug that was related to bumblebees, but no, in fact, they are the closest relatives of the group that includes the western bumblebee and the rusty patch bumblebee. They're just bumblebees that lost the knack for social living. So pretty interesting animals, and you should probably run into them. Oops, okay. We have a bunch of uncertainty in the world of bumblebees. There's a lot we don't know yet, despite centuries of research. Just quickly, why are some species doing great and some are not? What are the specific habitat requirements for these generalist bees? How do they vary between species? We don't know a lot about dispersal or movement patterns, because until recently, we haven't been able to track them with telemetry. That is rapidly becoming possible, which is really exciting. There's a lot that goes on in the dark underground that we can't see and we don't really understand. Reproduction, there are lots of mysteries. And then specifically males. We focus on the worker caste with most research, or sometimes the queens. We don't spend a lot of time working on males. So for example, males produce sperm like other animals. That's how they reproduce, right? We know zero about that. If you go look at the research, there's just nothing about the sort of biology of that part of the life of one of the two sexes of this animal. I know a grad student who's working on it, and it's kind of like she's discovering a lost continent or something. We just don't know anything. So this is just to let you know, you are going to see things that I can't explain, Katie can't explain. They're just cool mysteries that belong to male bumblebees like this Van Dyke's bumblebee, and to these systems. So why are we doing this Bumblebee Atlas? Well, we know that pollinators are declining in general, and bumblebees, about a quarter of them are at risk. Either they've become rare, or they are perched on the brink of extinction. 25% of all of them. So that's a lot. It's a bunch of different stressors and threats all hitting them at once, we think. So things like habitat loss to development, really big deal in California, pesticide exposure through agriculture, but also through development and people living where people live and doing what they do. Diseases of bees that are moved around with honeybees and also with commercial bumblebees. Climate change is a huge driver of changes for these bees. And we see interactions, I think, in all directions in this group of four things. So if you have a parasite, the pesticides are usually worse for you, and vice versa. So there are lots of interacting effects. And we're really concerned about a lot of these bees. And so that's one reason that we're doing this study. So we're lacking a lot of baseline data about where they occur. What time do they show up? What time do they disappear? Where are they now common that they were rare before, and so on. How do we do this? How do we get this information? We could ask a few academics to go out there and do their little studies and get a tiny little bit of data incrementally. But actually, the single best way to do this is with you, with community science. We've generated a huge data set in 3 years with this project. 18,000 records of bumblebees, 2,000 surveys. This is work I could never do on my own as a scientist, or a whole lab of people could. It would take them a decade or something. So that's the power of community science. It's real science, and it is actually the best way to get this information that we need to conserve these guys. And this slide is meant to convince you of that. Before we started the Pacific Northwest Bumblebee Atlas, we really didn't know a whole lot about the Western bumblebee and its occurrence patterns in coastal Washington and Oregon. And the Bumblebee Atlas found all of these different observations of the bee, and we got a lot more information about where it does exist, and actually, importantly, where it has disappeared from, like places right along the coast, as you can see in this map. So community science is a successful model that we at Xerces have been using for 7 or 8 years, and I'm excited you're part of it. So this is the last slide of the first part, and we hope that you will enjoy tonight and then go further with this. So after tonight, you'll take a short quiz, which will then let you get onto our scientific collecting permit. And there's some other stuff that we're going to talk to you about in just a minute about what comes next. But this is step one. You're here tonight. This is step one, and it's really great that you are here. So there's the URL for the quiz. You could write it down. You can take a look at it now if you want, but that is over material that we're going to present tonight. So I'm going to stop sharing. And Katie, do we want to answer questions?
Yeah, there was a couple here that I thought would be good for the group. One of them is related to that quiz.
Okay.
How are they going to know if their name is on the permit or not after they take the quiz? Will there be an email notification, physical mail? What's the process?
Great question. When you take the quiz, if you are successful, which means you got 9 out of 10 correct or something, you can take it as many times as you need to pass. Everyone passes. But once you pass, the next morning at 9:30 a.m., you'll get an automated email from us that says, welcome, thank you, and gives you some information about the project. You may have gotten this email if you signed up in the last 6 months, and attached to it there were some permits that were not that were expired. We have live permits that, again, I'm going to send to you later this week, but there's no document where you'll see your name on the permit. I have that document, but you'll get a notification from us. And you're welcome to check in with me about anything in the email that you don't understand, but that will be your indication that you're on the permit.
All right. And then there's a couple more in there. I'll let you look through them. Quite a few
Okay.
just came in, and I'll get my screens.
Okay, this is a really important one. So someone asks, if we took the quiz last year and we're on the permit for the project last year, or 2 years ago, or 3 years ago, do we need to test this year? No, you do not need to. We want you to be here tonight or at one of the other 2 workshops next month or in May, but we don't. You're already on the permit. You are legally ready to start collecting bees on Saturday in some parts of the state. So don't worry about that at all. And let's see, I'll do one more. How is genetics a threat to bumblebees? Um, that is a great question. Bumblebees, like other organisms, sometimes exist in small populations. They get isolated by various things. And we find that there just aren't a lot of mates that, a given bee is not related to. And so you get inbreeding depression, and you get a bunch of problems that come with inbreeding depression. It's actually much worse for bees than it is for some other types of insects and for mammals writ large. So small population size leads to some real problems in terms of genetic impoverishment for these animals, which then leads to other problems that cause them not to reproduce, et cetera. So I think we should. The other question was about gines, and I'll just answer this one, and then we'll move on. It's about 4 inches, 2 to 4 inches underground when they're overwintering. They don't go very deep. They dig this little tunnel, they bury themselves, and they're just below the maybe the root zone of the sod if you're in a grassy area. So they experience cold winter temperatures when it gets cold, and they experience warm stuff too. All right, with that, let's move on to Katie, and I'll try to answer these questions later, and I'll talk about what to do if I don't answer all the questions. Take it away.
Okay. All right. So now we're going to sort of jump into the nitty gritty of how to do the Atlas surveys, what kind of materials you're going to need. And if you don't catch everything here, this is all written down in the handbook. You can always go back and watch the recording. So don't worry about missing anything here tonight. So this might take about 70 minutes or so. If it's a little short, then we have a little fun video. And as Leaf was saying earlier, these Atlas projects have really taken off. The first one launched in the Pacific Northwest in 2018 in Washington, Idaho, and Oregon. And each year since then, we've grown to a new state or a new region, and we collaborate with many federal and state agencies, lots of university partners, lots of wonderful people helping to make these projects function and make sure everybody that volunteers is supported and you guys have what you need. So thank you for being here tonight and wanting to take part in this huge effort. So a little recap on the California Bumble Bee Atlas for the last couple of years. There's almost, or there is 1,100 permitted volunteers that are participating that have gathered 18,000 bumblebee observations, conducted almost 2,000 surveys, and completed nearly 60% of the grid cells, which is just amazing. To gather that amount of data in 3 short summers is way beyond what Leaf and I could do probably in 10 years. So thank you for taking part in this. If you've been surveying in the past, if this is your first year joining, I think you're going to have a really good time. Oh, there's a link up here at the top. If you want to learn more about the project highlights from California, you can go to the website /project highlights and you can sort of interact with the data and take a look at a few more graphs and charts that Leaf has prepared. So the broad overview of participating in the Atlas, the first step is to adopt your grid cell. And so you see the map on the screen here, all those little squares are grid cells that are open for adoption. And what that means is basically you're selecting a place in California that you want to conduct your surveys. So we're not assigning you a grid cell. You go onto the website and you can interact with this map, sort of zoom in, see which grid cell you want to adopt, and then fill out a form. If you're a returning volunteer, you don't need to adopt a grid cell unless you're going to change grid cells or you want to adopt another grid cell, then you would add that to your list. Once you've adopted your grid cell, then the minimum ask is that you conduct at least 2 surveys within that grid cell during the summertime. During a survey, you're doing a search for bumblebees in the area, and then you're also doing a quick habitat assessment. And when you're done with that, then you upload it to Bumblebee Watch. So we're going to get into each of those steps, but that's sort of a broad outlook on this. And the goal for this year, again, looking at the map on the screen here, is to visit those green and blue cells. So those are areas in the state that are undersurveyed. The green ones are high priority and the blue ones are medium priority. So that's the goal. But again, if you can't get to one of those grid cells, surveying in a gray one is perfectly okay too. So when it comes to catching bumblebees on a survey, this is kind of silly to try and explain online, but we're going to give it a shot. So netting a bee, when you think about chasing a butterfly, it's something that seems cartoonish, but there is a little bit of skill behind it that you're going to figure out the more surveys you do. So there's a few ways to swing a net. Some people will swing the net sort of at waist height in a figure 8 motion. If it's low vegetation, like the photo on the screen here, you can sort of drop the net over the top of the flower. Either way you end up swinging the net, it's really important to learn how to close that net, which is essentially when you flick your wrist and the long piece of the net flips over on itself. There are video instructions for this. You can also link up with a volunteer who's done it before, but you'll get the hang of it the more times you go out. Do pay attention when you're surveying. If it's windy, sometimes the wind can close the net before you've even swung, and then you're definitely going to miss the bee. When it comes to transferring the bee from the vial or from the net into a vial, again, it takes a little practice, but you're going to want to hold the tip of the net up, so the tapered end. If you hold that up, the bee will generally fly up into the net, and then you sort of close the net with your hand and restrict how far the bee can move in the net. Then you can take a vial and put the vial up into the net, sort of maneuver the bee into the vial. And it's really important not to put your hand over the top of the vial where the net is. A lot of people doing this for the first time will think that their hand is a natural lid, but that is a very good time that you can get stung. So you're going to then want to take the cap and stick it up into the net and close the vial off, being mindful not to sort of screw any bee feet. Their legs are really tiny. Sometimes they can get stuck in the caps. So make sure that the bee is at the other end of the vial before you screw the lid on. Stinging, it doesn't really happen in the field. If it does happen, I'd say the most common time is, again, when somebody tries to put their hand over that vial while the net is there. They're not out to sting you. They are going to make a pretty loud buzzing noise when they're in the vial because they're irritated. They don't know why they're sort of caught in this little tiny vial all of a sudden. But the more that you go out and do surveys and you get familiar with how to handle them, how to handle the nets and the vials, stinging is very rare. It really doesn't happen. But, if you are allergic, please bring your EpiPen out. If you do get stung, you can take a little piece of crushed ice from your cooler and just stick it on your hand. But again, it's not a huge thing to worry about. In-person events, there's a link down here at the bottom. These are fantastic if you want to go meet up with some other volunteers. There will be a Xerces coordinator there. You can learn how to do all of this, how to swing a net, how to transfer them into the vial, all of the stuff that just doesn't quite translate through the screen. The field trainings are a very, very fun time. Safety is a huge part of this. Just like when you're going for a hike somewhere, it could be a remote area, a state park. You want to make sure that you are prepared for the outdoors. So bring your water, snacks, proper hiking shoes, maps, paper maps if you're going somewhere where your cell phone isn't going to work. You're going to want to be aware of any poisonous plants in the area, if rattlesnakes are present, steep or rocky terrain. We're going out into nature, so make sure that you're prepared for those conditions. It's important to tell somebody your plan, especially if you're going out by yourself. Let somebody know where you're going and when they should expect you back. You can display this volunteer survey or placard in your car if you want to. Again, that's on the website. You can download it. These are helpful for putting in your car if you're in a remote area or somewhere that's more rural where there's not a lot of easily accessible parking spots and you have to pull over on the side of the road. you hike away from your car. Just let somebody in the area know what you're doing there. Working in pairs is really good for this, safety in numbers. It's also more fun to go catch bees with your friends, gallivanting around a field. Wherever you do end up surveying, please make sure that you have permission. And if there is something that could help you feel more safe while you're participating in this project, please reach out to us. We're always trying to learn ways that we can increase volunteer safety. So when we're looking for bees, the survey periods line up with peak bumblebee activity. And this varies depending on where you're located in the state. And as Leaf mentioned earlier, the specific dates are online on the website. But in general, Southern California is going to start in March and run through September. The Central Coast, Central Valley starts in April, runs through September. Northern California and the mountains run from May to September. And in years of drought, bumblebee activity might end early. So if you can, as soon as that survey season opens for you, try and get out and start your surveys. Don't wait till the last minute in case the bumblebees have already completed their life cycle. Where to look for bees. So within your grid cell, you have free range to sort of look for different habitats to go survey. You do need to make sure that you have permission to survey wherever you're going to go. So this could be your own backyard. If you have enough space, you're going to need about 2.5 acres to run a survey. If you have friends that have an acreage, please get written permission from anybody that's private land that's letting you survey. We might have to ask for copies of your written permission just to cover our bases. You can also survey along public roadsides and public rights of ways. There are public lands too that Xerces will acquire permits for. So national parks, national monuments, California state parks, Forest Service land, and BLM land. We are working to get the permits for those. So after you are a permitted volunteer, you'll be in the connection there and Leaf can get you what you need to survey. For those other public lands that are not in bold, the wildlife refuges, California Department of Fish and Wildlife lands, or like city, county, local parks, you will need to check in with them and you might need to acquire a permit. If you need help with that, definitely reach out to Leaf and we can sort of see how we can assist you there. All right, so where to look for bees, more habitat focused. California has many, many, many different types of habitats, and most of those are home to some kind of bumblebee community. So the graph that you can see there on the screen is showing the abundance of bees found in different habitats. So you can see wetlands, grasslands, woodlands, forests, riparian, all have quite a few bees being found there. But you can also search in the mountains and scrub habitat and urban areas. So there's lots of different places. You sort of want to pick somewhere that has an abundance of flowers in bloom where you're seeing bee activity. And this is a catch and release project. So we're not killing any bees here. Basically what your role is during the survey is to walk around a habitat and search for bees on flowers. That's our main goal here. And to do this, when you're setting up, so you're in your grid cell, you found somewhere that you want to survey, you want to identify somewhere that has good habitat. So when you get to your potential location, you can get out, look around a little bit, make sure that you're seeing pollinator activity, you're seeing some good blooms. And if it doesn't seem suitable, have a backup location nearby that's ready. You can drive over there, check out the next one, and see which spot is going to be better for your survey. Once you have selected your site, you can establish your plot. So sort of mentally map out how big of an area you're going to search. And we're looking for a 1 hectare plot, which again is about 2.5 acres. And once you start your survey, it's going to be a 45 person minute survey. And I'll explain that in a future slide. During the survey, you're going to be looking for bumblebees on all kinds of flowers. So there are some flowers that are more inconspicuous than others, but that doesn't mean that bumblebees won't be visiting them. So make sure to look pretty thoroughly on all the blooms that are in your survey area. As you find bees, you're going to try and net every one of them, transfer them to a vial, and place those vials on ice. At the end of your survey period, you should have walked your entire plot. You sort of have an idea for what the habitat is like. And then we're going to photo document each bee. And again, I'm going to talk about photographs in the next slide. This is just sort of a in-depth how we do a survey. The last part of your survey is to fill out that habitat assessment form, which is on the same data sheet as your bumblebee form. And you want to save this for the end because in theory, you've walked around your entire survey site and you'll be able to answer those questions like what kind of nesting features are there? What are the management types? How many different plant species are in bloom? So it's good to do the habitat survey towards the end. So for each survey that you do, there's a few materials that are helpful or necessary to bring out into the field, including an insect net, a cooler, some vials or viewing jars. People get very creative with what they use to catch bees with or place bees in. We like to use 50 milliliter or 30 milliliter plastic vials that you might see in a lot of these photos. Other people use old prescription jars. Some people use glass, but those are a little bit heavier. And when they break in the field, it's messier than having plastic. But the plastic ones can crack over time, so you have to replace them. We have a whole lot of information sort of on the details of where to get a lot of these materials on the website as well. But you also want to bring a camera or a smartphone, your data sheets, a writing utensil, something to keep track of your time. Again, paper maps if you're going somewhere where your GPS doesn't work, field guides for both plants and bees, a notebook, a hand lens if that's useful for you, extra batteries if you're planning on being out for a long day and you need to keep your camera charged. And then personal items and safety items, drinking water, sun protection, food, EpiPen, whatever you need to have a good day in the field, make sure you have that packed. And then just a note on coolers, some of the newer, fancier ice packs and coolers have the ability to get below freezing, which can be too cold for bees. So to make sure that we're not killing bees, please make sure that you're using some setup of ice and a cooler that is above freezing. So keep it at or above 32 degrees Fahrenheit. Generally, if you use store-bought cubed ice and place it in your typical igloo Yeti cooler, the bees are going to be okay. Like that is a good setup. Just cubed ice from the store or the gas station works pretty well. So there's two types of surveys that you can run. The first one is a point survey, and these are definitely the preferred survey. If we had to pick one of these 2 points or roadsides, we would definitely prefer that you do point surveys. So for a point survey, you're going to pick an area within your grid cell that is 1 hectare, 2.5 acres. If you think in terms of football, it's about 2.5 football fields that you're walking around, which that for some reason really helps me when I'm in the field trying to map out how far I can go thinking about football fields. It works. In this area, you're going to search for 45 person minutes. And this is just active search time, right? So anytime that you are transferring a bee to a vial, putting that vial on ice, making notes, taking a sip of water, your timer should be paused. So that 45-minute timer is only when you're looking for bees. And it's 45 person minutes because the more people you have, the less time you have to survey for. So you sort of take the number of surveyors, divide it by 45, and that becomes your new survey time. So for example, if there are 3 people surveying, we take 45 divided by 3. Each person is going to search for bees for 15 minutes. So it can really reduce the amount of time that you have to be out there. These surveys can take place anywhere within your adopted grid cell, again, as long as you have permission to be out there. And then you're going to conduct a habitat assessment after your bee survey. The other type of survey is a roadside survey, which, if you're in a part of California where there's not much public land, sometimes these roadside surveys are helpful because it allows us to get information from these places where we can't just trek around. So to do a roadside survey, you're going to pick a stretch of road that's about 10 miles long, and you're going to conduct 5 mini surveys along that stretch that are at least a half a mile apart. And each one of these surveys is going to be 15 person minutes long, followed by a habitat assessment. So 5 smaller surveys, a little bit more travel involved. The last type of, it's not a survey, but it's sort of an observation, are these incidentals, right? So as you get involved and you start looking for bumblebees, you're going to see them everywhere while you're walking your dog, maybe while you're, at the park, while you're passing a grocery store that has a pollinator planting. Bumblebees are going to be everywhere. And we encourage you to take pictures of them. These are just happenstance sightings that you can submit and share. And sometimes people find some rare species just from these passive observations. So to do this, you just sort of take a photo of the bee and you upload that to Bumblebee Watch along with the date, location, and floral host if you can. And that's the end of that one. So when you're planning a point survey, safety comes first, right? Make sure that somebody knows where you're going. They know when you should be back. The roads, whether or not you have GPS working, you've got a paper map, and you want to be flexible, right? So a lot of times when I'm planning my surveys, I will use Google Earth and sort of pan and zoom and look for areas that are green, areas that are near water. But sometimes when you show up to these sites that you've picked out from a computer, they don't match up. Maybe some of them have been burned. Maybe some of them have been heavily grazed or there's cattle on them. Whatever the reason is, you can't actually get onto that land to do your survey. So make sure you have a backup location that's near the first place that you want to go. And so plan multiple locations. Make sure you stay flexible. If it's not the habitat itself, weather conditions can sometimes get in the way. And the minimum requirement, again, when you adopt a grid cell, is to conduct at least 2 surveys. And those 2 surveys can be conducted in the same location on different days, or they can be conducted in 2 completely different locations. You can conduct more than 2 surveys, but the minimum that we ask you to try to do is 2. We already talked about the timer, 45 person minutes. And there are a few pros and cons here with the point surveys. So the pros are that this type of survey is the best for us when we're trying to learn about what these bees need to be efficiently and effectively conserved and how we can alter our management practices. These point surveys are the most helpful. It's a longer survey, so we have more chances of detecting rare species. We get a lot of detailed information about a single location. It's typically a more natural environment compared to our roadsides, and there's fewer logistics, right? You're sort of driving to one spot, hiking to your survey location, and that's it. The cons is that it's only one area within a very large grid cell, and we might miss species that don't have a nest nearby because we're not really traveling outside of that 2.5 acre plot. So when it comes to planning roadside surveys, safety first for sure with these ones, same kind of things with the point surveys. Make sure somebody knows your plan when you're coming back. Make sure you have your maps. Make sure you've got your EpiPen if you need one of those. But also with roadside surveys, you want to make sure that you're pulling off somewhere safely, that your vehicle is parked in a safe area, not on a hill anywhere. You want to be visible. So if you can wear a vest during these, that's encouraged. Let's see what else with roadside surveys. Property ownership. So a lot of times in rural or remote parts of the country, the property boundary isn't necessarily going to be fenced. So if you're on a county road versus a state road, sometimes the ditch that you can sort of walk in as public road can vary. So make sure you know how far you can walk on the side of the road to still stay on public land. And then make sure somebody knows your plan. If you get a flat tire out somewhere and you don't have GPS, it could be a really long day for you. So when planning roadsides, again, you want to pick a stretch of road that's about 10 miles long, and you're going to do 5 stops along that route that are at least a half a mile apart. So each stop that you make, you're going to have a 15 person minute survey plus a habitat survey. So at the end of your entire roadside survey, you are going to have 5 data sheets that are each going to be entered. And it's really important that as you're doing these roadside surveys, you keep track of them in sequential order, right? It's helpful for us if you can use a related name. So for example, if you were on West Road, you have a West Road number 1, West Road number 2, West Road number 3, and that really helps us when we're analyzing the data on the back end to be able to make sure that, okay, here's this complete roadside survey. Pros and cons of roadside surveys. Pros, we get much larger spatial distribution across the landscape, right? Instead of just visiting one spot in that grid cell, we're sort of traversing across 10 miles of it. So that gives you the opportunity to go through different habitat types, maybe find some different species, and it's generally easier access, right? A lot of these roadside surveys, you pull off on the side of the road where it's safe to do so, jump out of the car, look for bees for 15 minutes, jump back in and go. The cons is that many of our roadsides tend to be filled with invasive non-native plants. So not necessarily what we're looking for, but those interactions still occur. And these surveys are also much shorter. So there's a good chance that we'll miss a lot of the species that are in the area because we're not spending a huge chunk of time there. And then lastly, a note on incidental observations. So these are very casual, opportunistic, passive, sort of happenstance photos that you can take. And you can take them anywhere. It can be outside of your grid cell. It can be, if you're ever in Nebraska, you can take a picture of a bumblebee in Nebraska. But we still need high quality photographs of them to make sure that we can identify the bee. And then you upload your photos to Bumblebee Watch. And you also want to submit the date that you observed the bee, the location, and if possible, a floral host. So these you can do for fun. You don't have to do them. I will say that we've learned quite a bit about just like random rare occurrences, whether it's a rare species or a species way outside of its range, just from somebody taking a random photo and submitting it. So it's kind of fun to see what you can find. Okay, incidental pros and cons. Pros, less time consuming, very easy. They can take place anywhere, can take place anywhere in the United States or Canada, no space or time or area requirements. The photos can give good ecological context. So if you look closely in the photo here, you can see that this bee is actually being eaten by a crab spider. Pretty cool. The cons, there's no measure of effort, right? So everybody conducting surveys in California and in all the other Atlas states were able to compare that data because they're using the same standardized protocols. They're all effort-based. We know how they were conducted. With these incidental observations, there's more human bias and no description of habitat again, right? There's no effort base, there's no data sheets being filled out. So useful to some degree, but definitely as part of the Atlas, we need you to conduct those point and roadside surveys. Safety for the bees. So bees can transmit and get sick. Diseases, pathogens, parasites can all be transferred around. And as we're going from different places, it's really, really important that you wash your vials after each survey, or if you're on a roadside survey, after each stop, to make sure that we're keeping our equipment as clean as possible. There's a few ways to do this for your vials and your nets. You can either use a 10% bleach solution, rinse it, let the net air dry and the vials air dry. You can use 70% alcohol or hydrogen peroxide. You can use hot soapy water, give it a scrub, rinse it, let it air dry. All of those options work pretty well. Some people have vials that they can just plop in the dishwasher. Other people will create some sort of either a bleach or an alcohol solution in a spray bottle that they just keep in their car, spray their nets and vials as they go. Find a system that works for you. It's a lot easier to do if you can sort of make it work for your own brain. Another thing about vials is limiting the bee's time in them at the ambient temperature. So as soon as you transfer a bee from a net to a vial, try to get that bee into the ice chest as soon as you can. Don't let it stay in the vial sort of at normal temperature for more than 5 minutes. But the bees can stay on ice for up to 120 minutes. Okay, photography. So I don't know how many of you here are here because you like taking nature photos, but there's quite a few volunteers that learn about this project because they want to take pretty pictures of bees. So taking pretty pictures of bees and taking pictures that we can identify bees from can be one and the same, but there's often a few angles that we're going to ask you to take that, they're not the prettiest, they're not showing the whole creature, but it's a feature that we need to see to identify the bee down to species. So a few things that you want to make sure that you have in your photos are the hind leg, which allows us to determine the sex of the bee and whether or not it's a cuckoo or a true bumblebee. The next is the head. So when we're identifying bees, we're looking a lot at the color of the hairs on the front of the face and on the top of the head, and the cheek length, which Leif will probably talk about in his identification. It's definitely not something we're going to ask you to learn to participate in this project, but if you're curious, cheek length is part of bee identification. So if you're able to get it in a photo, it's very helpful. The thorax is another part that we need to see, which is the middle part of the body where the wings attach and the legs attach. And here you're going to be looking for colors and patterns, and then the abdomen as well. So again, we're going to be looking for colors and patterns on the abdomen on the top and sort of from a side view. If the bee has a yellow face and a single yellow stripe on the abdomen, you're also going to want to flip the bee over so that you can take a picture of the ventral side of her abdomen, or sort of the belly of the bee, because there's a few species that mimic each other out there. And again, I'm sure Leif will go over that in his identification section. So to zoom in a little more, I'll try and get my pen out here. So when we're looking at the head, we want a picture that shows the hair color on the front of the face, which they're black here on this bee, and on the top of the head. So right here, they're black on this bee as well. And then the cheek length, which is going to be beneath the eye to the mandible. The next part of the body is the thorax, so the round central part of the bee here where the wings attach. If you can get a top-down photo of the bee and a photo from the side that shows sort of the colors beneath the wing base, it is very helpful. And then lastly is the abdomen. So over here, we've got sort of this illustration that says T1, T2, T3. Those are each talking about different segments of the abdomen. So the first abdominal segment is called tergite 1. So we've abbreviated this to tergite 1, T1, T2, T3, all the way to T6 for a female bee. And depending on the species, these tergites can be different colors. Some of them have slight patterns to them. So getting a nice clear image of the top and a side photo of the bee is super helpful. You are going to have to learn how to part the wings open so that you can see that top-down view of the abdomen. And please, please, please make sure to check your photos before you leave the field. It's always heartbreaking when somebody spends so much time planning to go do a survey. They head out into the field, they catch all these bees, and then they come back and their photos are too dark or out of focus, and it basically renders that data as unusable. So what I like to do when I'm photographing bees in the field is find a place that is in the shade and take pictures of like a pencil eraser, something small, and make sure your camera is focusing on that small item. Make sure it's properly lit, make sure it's clear before you actually start photographing bees. Okay, so to summarize all of that up, the first point here is for incidentals. Patience is key. You still want to get good photos for those passive observations, but they're still useful and you can upload them. For the formal surveys, so those point and the roadside surveys, you're going to want to capture the bees using a net, put those bees into a clean vial, transfer that vial to a cooler where the bees can sit. It takes about 10 to 20 minutes before they are chilled enough for you to take photographs of them, but they can stay in the cooler for up to 120 minutes. So during your survey time, it should be totally okay. You're going to want to take detailed photos of each of those bees, record their floral host, and make sure you have very good notes for which photographs go with which bee. And then you're going to want to release all of those bees within 100 meters of where you captured them. So now when we take a look at data sheets here, when you're in the field, everything's going to be handwritten. But then when you go to upload it, we've got a series of check boxes and drop-down boxes where you can enter in your information pretty quickly. The data sheets are on the website for you to download. Okay, so the first part here is sort of just general site information. The site name is totally up to you. What you want to put in there, that's for your own purposes, for you to relate back to which site you were at. There's a section to write in the grid cell that you're in, the date, the latitude and longitude, number of observers, initials, survey type, whether you're doing a or a roadside survey, the survey method there. So this one, I don't know if you can read that tiny, let me get my pointer right here. I'm right here, the survey method. So what we want you to do is capture every single bee, every single bumblebee that you can when you're surveying. However, there might be a time where you get to this wonderful habitat that is just buzzing and there's absolutely no way you can catch all of the bees. In that instance, you want to try and catch bees that are different. So do your best to see if you can, look at any differences in color patterns between the bees and try and catch the different ones. But we don't want you to default to that. The ideal is for you to catch every single bee out there. But we understand things happen in the field, so do your best here to catch every bee, but if you don't, annotate this box here with whatever you did. Then we have the start and end times, some weather information here. And then down in this box, the next question is survey area. So this is where we're going to pick up the data sheet again after we've surveyed for bees. And you've walked around your survey area for about 45 minutes. You're going to circle the dominant habitat type. So were you in a grassland, a woodland, agriculture, developed? And then over here, you have the option to write in 3 types of habitat that are in the surrounding area. So what we mean by surrounding area is anything that is within sight view outside of your plot. So you can write in, maybe you were in a grassland, but there was a riparian area just beyond that and then the woodland. You can write in those two. You don't have to write in any if there was only one habitat type that you were in. This is just an optional thing here. And then down at the bottom of this sheet that we're seeing, it says how much of the survey area has flowering resources available. So again, after you've walked your whole area, you want to sort of keep in mind how much of the area that you walked through were there plants in bloom that bees could forage on. Was it half of the area had blooms available, 90%, or not very many blooms? You might circle 10%. Okay, next is the nesting habitat. And this is an area for you to check off different features that you see on the landscape that we associate with bumblebee nesting. So did you see bunch grasses? Did you see rodent holes? Did you see brush pile? Was there leaf litter or pine needles? Was there a rock pile? If you saw any of these things, check them off. If you didn't see any of these things, we have a box for none of these features in the area were present. Next, we're going to ask about management practices. So here there's an option for yes, this is occurring, no, this is not occurring, or suspect, meaning it might be happening, but you're not quite sure. So mowing, livestock grazing, native grazing, and maybe if you don't see the animals, you might see their cow pies, or you might see hoof prints. Those are still tracks that let us know those are in the area. Fire, honeybee hives. This one, if there are hives in the area, you can write down how many hives you saw. If you're in an area where there are a bunch of honeybees all over your plot, you might put suspect, right? You don't see any actual hives near you, but there are an abundance of honeybees. There's also a place for notes if you want to add any notes down there. And then we have volunteer data. So this little box is easy to forget, but try your hardest not to forget it. This is very important for us to track how much effort people are putting towards helping us conserve bumblebees. So there's an area to write down your start and stop times, including your planning and driving time. So how much total time did you put into surveying for bumblebees on this day? We're going to ask about miles, how far you drove round trip. And then when you're entering this data, you can also put in that time. So how much time you spent organizing your photos at home, if you had to do any editing to them, how much time did it take you to upload that? So all of that time and effort, we're hoping to count. And then on the back side of the data sheet, there's a little bit more about the plant species. So the top question here is about how many different plant species were in bloom. And this is only counting the species that were not visited by bumblebees. So when you catch a bumblebee and you're photo documenting it, you're also recording the floral host. So on this list here, we're not going to double count or double record those plants. So you're only going to circle the number of plants here that were in bloom, but that you did not catch bumblebees on. There's a place down here to write in the common name and or the scientific name, whichever one is easier for you to do, and a section for photo numbers or notes. So those photo numbers, we're not going to ask you to explicitly submit plant photos. But if you don't know what the plant is, sometimes it's good to be able to go home later and either upload that to iNaturalist or look through an identification guide. Sometimes you can post it in the California Bumble Bee Atlas Facebook group. Maybe somebody else will know what plant you saw. But do your best to be as specific as possible with these plants, right? Because there are some plants like thistle. There are native thistles that we want to know about when the bumblebees are landing on them, and there are introduced thistles. So if you just type in thistle, it sort of leaves a gap for us that we have a really hard time teasing apart. So be specific here. When you enter it onto the website, the data set is connected to iNaturalist. So as you start typing in plant names, it will give you options. Okay, and then down at the bottom here is where you'll photo document your bumblebees. So there is a column for bumblebee species. If you know your bumblebees really well, that's great. You can fill this out with the names. If you don't know your bumblebees, that is okay. You can write in bee number 1, bee number 2, bee number 3. Each bee that you catch in your vial is going to have its own row here. You're going to want to record the host plant that each of those bees was caught on, and then the photo numbers. So the photo numbers are very, very important, because if you go to a survey location and maybe you caught 5 of the same bee and you pull up all those images later on your computer or you're looking at them on the phone, they're all going to look very, very similar. So when you're in the field taking photos of your bees, you can either, put a number near them, whether that's on the vial cap or maybe you have a piece of paper that you're photographing on, you can write a number next to the bee. Other people will sort of take pictures of the first bee and then take a picture of the ground before photographing the next bee so that there's a visual spacer. Other people will use a dry erase board that they sort of keep track of the bee on while they're photographing. There's many, many different ways to keep track, and just make sure that you find a way to do it so that we can keep the data straight as you're entering it. This column over here is useful for when you're uploading your data onto Bumblebee Watch. You can check off which bees you've submitted already. Again, if you have a really long list of bees, it's easy to skip over a row. So make sure that you're keeping track of your bees pretty thoroughly. And what if you don't catch any bees? Please submit your data anyways. These knoll surveys are very, very important to know where somebody has actually surveyed for bees. They've put effort forth and have not found anything. That is a huge, huge benefit for us to have that information. So when you're submitting data, you can see this checkbox down here. This is a screenshot from Bumblebee Watch. After you've entered in your habitat data, it's going to ask you if this was a knoll survey. If you did not find any bumblebees, you want to check this box. And that lets us know that, hey, I did the survey, didn't find any bumblebees. Okay, so now we're moving to Bumblebee Watch, which is the website where you submit data. And first thing, people can get confused when they're first starting out with the website. So we have Bumblebee Atlas, which is the project website where you would go to find contact information, webinar recordings, print materials, data sheets, handbooks. All of the stuff related to the California Bumblebee Atlas will be on the Bumblebee Atlas website. But when you go to submit your data, it's going to Bumblebee Watch. So Bumblebee Watch is very similar to iNaturalist or eBird, if you've ever used those platforms. It's a website that's gathering bumblebee observations in the United States and Canada. So the basics for uploading data here are just on the sheet. Everything's going to go to bumblebeewatch.org. You will have to register for an account if you haven't done so yet. Try and enter your data as soon as you can after you've finished your field work. Within a week is best, just in case there's a section on your data sheet that you forgot to fill in, or there's some minor detail that didn't get written down. It's a lot easier to recall that stuff if you submit your data closer to the actual survey date. Keep good record of which photos go with which bee. Include only the most useful photos. So you might take a lot of photos when you're in the field, but you can submit 5 per bee to Bumblebee Watch. So make sure that you're getting the ones that show a lot of different angles of the bee, showing those features that we talked about, the face, the hind leg, the abdomen, the thorax. And if you've gotten all those angles and you're only at, say, 3 photos, you can include a photo of the host plant for us just to look at. So the Bumblebee Watch platform looks like this if you haven't been to it before. If you weren't around last year, Bumblebee Watch got a major upgrade. It functions a lot better than it used to. It's got more of a modern interface to it now. And just a couple of terms here with Bumblebee Watch. So a checklist is what we call a survey. So on here, you're going to have checklist IDs, which is essentially a number that is assigned to your survey. And you're also going to have siting IDs. So each bee that you submit will have a specific siting ID and be assigned to a checklist ID if that bee was observed during a survey. So when you go to submit data, whether it's an incidental or a formal survey, you're going to click this add siting button. And then it's going to give you two options. So when you're selecting your project, Bumblebee Watch over here is for those passive sightings, those incidentals. They weren't conducted during a survey. You just happen to see the bee. We submit through Bumblebee Watch. If you conducted a survey, whether it was a point survey or a roadside survey, you're going to submit through Bumblebee Atlas. And there is this menu down here, the drop-down menu for regional projects. Please do not use that. This is a relic of our last website that we are trying to still figure out how to make it work properly. Don't use this. If you submit your data there, there's a good chance it will get lost. So just use Bumblebee Watch for incidentals, Bumblebee Atlas for survey data. So when you click Bumblebee Atlas, you're going to be presented with all of these fields here that line up with your data sheet. So you're going to start with the where, all of the site information stuff. If you click this select on map button, you can sort of zoom in and click somewhere on a map and it will auto-populate your latitude and longitude for you. If it's a new location, it's going to ask you to enter in a site name. But if you go back and survey that same location again in the future, you can use the drop-down menu here where it says choose from your locations and it will already be saved in your profile. Then we're going to go to the when. So part of the location is entering in the accuracy. So based on your coordinates and where you've selected on the map, how accurate is that? How close to your actual survey location is that in meters? You're going to enter in the date and what kind of survey you did. Then the collection method, again, hopefully you captured all the bees or at least tried to that you could. How large your survey area was, number of surveyors, start and stop time, how long it was, basically everything on the data sheet. There's going to be a box for you to enter it in here. The habitat is going to be a drop-down menu. So again, you have your main dominant habitat type, and then you have the option to enter in 3 habitat types for that surrounding area. I have a drop-down box for the flowering resources, check boxes for nesting resources. So what did you see out there? Again, if you didn't see any of these, there is a box to check none of the above. And it's going to go into management resources or practices where you can select yes, no, or suspect for each one of these. There's a place for little notes. And then the number of flowering plants. Again, this is just the plants that were in bloom, but you didn't observe any bumblebees on them. When you select a number category from here, whether it's 1 to 2, 3 to 5, 6 to 10, Bumblebee Watch will then generate the number of spaces for you to enter in your plant names. And you don't have to enter in both the common name and the scientific name. You can enter one. If you do know both, it is helpful for us. And again, this is connected to iNaturalist now. So as you start typing in a plant name, you're going to see sort of this drop down that's auto-populating plant names that are associated with what you're typing. You do want to try and be as specific as possible with this, because when you type in, let's say, clover, it's going to give you a lot of different options that might not even be in your area. So if you can type in the exact type of clover, that will lead you to entering the correct information. Okay, and then we did number of flowering species, then volunteer information down at the bottom. If it was a volunteer effort, you can check this box here. Whether or not you used online resources for training, and this is separate from these live webinars. So this will not count for that checkbox, but let's say you visit this video in the future to just remind you of something, let us know how much time you spent doing that. And then you sort of sign your name at the bottom, say, yes, all this information is true. Did you see bumblebees or not? And then you click submit. So if you did submit a null survey, when you click submit here, you're done, right? We have your data, it's saved. But if you did observe bumblebees, it's going to bring you to another page and ask you to enter in photos. So for each bee, you're going to have this sort of sheet of data to enter per bee. So if you saw 20 bees, you're going to do this sheet here that you see 20 times. For each bee, you can add up to 5 photographs. You can add which species you think it is from a regional drop-down menu. If you don't know what species it is totally okay to leave it as bumblebee or bombus SP, and somebody on the back end will assign it an identification. The count feature is for experts only. The sex, you can put in sort of the sex or the caste, whether it was a male, female, queen, worker. The default is not determined. So if you don't know or you don't want to guess, you can just leave that as a not determined. And then you'll want to enter in the floral host. Again, here being as specific as possible. If you know the scientific name, that's the best, but if not, a specific common name is helpful. There's also a spot for any observation notes related to this bee if you want to add anything, and then you click add sighting. Once you click add sighting, it's going to bring you back to a page that shows you sort of all the bees that you've entered. So if you have an additional one, you're going to see a button that says add sighting, and it will bring you to this page again, and you keep going until you've got all your bees there. Okay, so to summarize all of that, you're going to adopt a grid cell, plan out your point or roadside surveys, conduct your surveys, and upload your data. Very simplified task list, even though there's lots of little things to learn as you're starting out. There are many, many resources available. We have the Atlas handbook here, which is basically the written version of this webinar. You'll find a field guide to bring out, just a simplified one-pager to bring into the field with you. Your data sheets. The California Bumble Bee Atlas website has a lot of information on it. And there's also a Facebook group of volunteers if you need to ask a question, if you want to find somebody near you to go survey with, if you have plant pictures, bee pictures, or you just want to connect with other bee people, this is a good place to go. There are a few other identification guides that have more information than that one pager from the last slide. One of these is a really nice identification guide to the bumblebees of North America. It's a book that you can purchase. And the other one is a PDF that you can download from the internet called Bumblebees of the Western United States. Both of these have the color variations for the different species that occur in California, sort of their range, distribution, and some natural history notes about them. Beyond those two, you can also utilize bugguide.net. You can utilize Bumblebee Watch or iNaturalist. Some ways that these are helpful are if you are going to a new area to survey for bumblebees, you can jump on iNaturalist, zoom into that area, see what plants or bees have been observed in that area and whether or not it might be good. Um, if you want to learn about different color variations for bees in your area or what species exist in your area, you can jump on Bumblebee Watch, filter down to the county that you're in California, and just look through pictures of verified bumblebees on there. Bug Guide is also very good for getting some nice photos and some expert identifications. So lots of resources available. And of course, the Atlas team at Xerces is also available to help with questions. There's also an older publication of bumblebees and cuckoo bees of California that you can check out if you want to go into a deep dive. And then just a few notes on environmental compliance. So Xerces has a memorandum of understanding and some scientific collecting permits to sort of aid with this. But basically, because we're handling insects and we're walking through some sensitive areas, we want to make sure that we are minimizing our disturbance. So when you take the quiz, you'll learn more details about each of these and how we need to make sure that our surveys are in compliance with them. Special note on Franklin's bumblebee. This is a federally endangered species. It has not been seen since 2006, but if you're sampling in Siskiyou or Trinity counties up in Northern California, while you're not likely to find it, you might win the bumblebee lottery and observe it. If you do, that will be very exciting, but please don't post it to social media or publicize it. We want to avoid other people learning about this species and potentially causing harm to the population up there. So if you do find the bee, please contact Leaf immediately. And when you upload it to Bumblebee Watch, make sure you mark it as private. And when you're uploading observations to Bumblebee Watch, this is a screenshot from our old website, but there will be a button that's very obvious to say private or not. So if you do find this bee, please mark this as private. Any more questions about compliance, they can go to Hillary Sardinius. And if you're interested or your organization is interested in getting more involved with Atlas and you want to do your own permit, there are websites where you can learn about that. And I think we can stop there. We'll see if Leaf has anything to add to this.
Thank you so much, Katie. That's great.
Yeah.
We're a little short on time, so I think I'm going to answer one question that I should answer rather than Katie, and then we're going to save a few questions. And if we don't get to them at the end, I'm going to type up answers and I will email that to you. We have a record of your email address later. So the one question, it's three questions actually about the scientific collecting permit. So this is a document from California Department of Fish and Wildlife that enables our work. It also comes with this separate document called a Memorandum of Understanding, or MOU, and that covers the legal protections for 4 California species, which I'll talk about in just a minute. So you need both documents. You'll get both documents when you pass the quiz. It is similar to a permit you may have if you're a professional wildlife biologist, but this one allows us to have many people on the same permit. It's a little special. Relatedly, someone asked if they bring friends or family, can that person also do surveying? The short answer is no, they can't handle the bees or catch the bees with a net if they're not permitted to do so, even if you're there and you are permitted. However, I encourage you to bring friends and family. Just have them do all the other stuff if they want to participate. So one person could run the cooler, a person could take notes, someone could walk around and look at habitat types and things like that. So I encourage you to bring people, but just remember that the permit only covers you as a bee handler. One other thing, someone asked about that, if they are in a wheelchair, and we absolutely would love to have your participation and can work with you to make that more possible for you. But it's the same answer legally from CDFW that you would be the permit holder, so you would need to be doing the netting. So if you'd like to follow up with me, I could help you think through how you might participate. Again, we would like you to participate, and if you'd like to do that, so we can work that out. So let's take a break now for about 3 minutes. I'm sorry, such a short break, but we need to get another 25 minutes or so of content in before the end of the hour. So I have 6:39. Let's come back at 6:42 and we'll get going again. Thanks. Okay. I hope everyone's back. I'm sorry to give you such a short break. But let's get going with the third and final module. This is about identification. And I have two quick messages that are not about identification before I get started so that I don't forget to tell you. One is about the events page of the website that Katie talked about. You'll only find a single or maybe two events on there right now, but I am working behind the scenes on 10 of them or more. So I will soon be dumping a bunch more events out there statewide. So come back and look at those. You'll also hear from me via the newsletter about some of those events. But just briefly, in April, I'll be in Sonoma and Colusa counties doing events. In May, there's a Central Valley trip planned. In June, a Central Coast trip. In July, a Sierras trip where I'll do at least one event in a national park. And then finally in August, I'm going to do northern events. So there will be one in Arcata, perhaps Redding or Red Bluff. So that's that. The other thing is about the land access permits. We do not have all the permits in hand yet, although we have applied for them. So right now we have most of the national parks permits, but we don't have the state parks, the state forests, or the BLM yet. We expect them basically any day, but there's some uncertainty there. So I'm going to communicate with you via the newsletter as soon as I have other permits. But please get in touch if you want to work starting on Saturday, let's say at a national park. Okay, so this module is about identification. I already gave you that permits update. We already know an awful lot about bumblebees in California. And so, as I said in the first module, we need to collect baseline data, and that's what we're up to with this project. But we do have some shoulders to stand on. One set is those of Robin Thorpe, this man here, who is a wonderful bumblebee taxonomist who worked at UC Davis for his career, wrote a lot about the bumblebees of California, and really informed a lot of us in what we do now. He was a great mentor and friend, and so we like to just recognize that he undergirds part of these identification stuff that I'm going to talk about now. So to talk about morphology, we do need to talk a little about some of the sort of insect vocabulary about body parts. Insects have three body parts, right? They have a head, a thorax, and an abdomen. And of course, each of those is broken into many smaller parts. Just to go through them quickly, the head, the top of the head, we call the vertex. The front of the head between the antennae, we call the face. And that's a common word, right? But it's sort of a technical word that we use in insects. So you'll see it in keys. You'll see me talk about it in places like this. The cheek, another common term that we use in a technical sense. It's this space between the compound eye and the mandible, and I'm going to show you that in a slide in just a sec. The antenna, self-explanatory, but the actual segments sometimes matter to identification. The bee has compound eyes, and it also has what we call simple eyes, or ocelli, which are up near the vertex or on the vertex. And you can see those three dots in the little cartoon. The thorax has lots of different segments that are covered by the hair, and we don't have to worry about those. But you'll see that when we talk about ID, we're going to talk about the front of the thorax, the back of the thorax, or the sides. So pay attention to the morphology of that thing. The bee has wings sometimes, but not very often. We'll talk about the color of the wings or something like that. The pollen basket with which that arrow is pointing to is super important for some of the identification. It has two other names, a corbicula or a scopa. You can just call it pollen basket, and I'll try to only use that common name for now. And then on the abdomen, as Katie said, we number the segments T1 through T6 on females and through T7 on males. T stands for tergum, which is just the technical name for that segment. And then on the underside, we do the same thing with the sternal abdominal segments. So it's S1, S2, S3. So you'll see those abbreviations, and they shouldn't scare you. They're just basic terms for these overlapping segments that you can easily see on the abdomen. The cheek. The cheek is this little space. It's downhill. It's below the compound eye. and it is just immediately above where the jaws attach, the mandible. And here in this photo, you can see the right mandible, but you have to imagine where the left mandible is attaching to the head. And so those two red arrows are showing you, in one case, the height, and the other, the width. And the cheek length, the cheek character is really about the ratio of those two things. So we have a whole set of bees with longer than wide cheeks, and a whole set with shorter than wide. And unfortunately, the largest number is right on the bead of like equal, and so it's not very useful. But this is rusty patch bumblebee, doesn't occur in California, but it's a good one for indicating a bee that has a short cheek. This is a short cheek. I am going to walk you through a simplified flowchart for Bumblebee ID, and this is it. We're going to go through it piece by piece in a second. But basically, this is the level of identification skill that you need to develop. You don't have to become an expert to participate in this project. In fact, I do not want you to feel turned off by the project because of this sciencey ID stuff. You don't have to learn to identify these bees at all to be a wonderful participant. We want you to put a name on them, but the most important thing for you to do is take good photos, because even when you name the bee for us in Bumblebee Watch, Katie or I will still go through and confirm your ID. So identification isn't actually your main job, but of course, that's what a lot of people are here for, to understand the diversity and why is it colored like this or that. And so that's what we're up to in this last module. So let's start at the top. We have a mystery insect in hand, and we want to know, is it a bee, just a bee, not just necessarily a bumblebee, but any bee, or is it some other insect? So at that stage, well, here's a little quiz for you, and it's not a Zoom quiz where I'm going to ask you to interact, but just look at these 5 photos and choose the bees and choose the things that aren't bees. Is it a bee? In fact, only one of these is a bee, and it's the one that looks like a wasp. So bees, they are often hairy, but not always. And then some of their mimics or lookalikes can be very hairy. So all of the other animals here are flies, and these are flies that mimic bees. There's this whole series of insects that mimic stinging insects and avoid predation as a result. And so bees are really variable looking, but they're generally going to have that pollen basket on the females. There are a number of other things. They have branched hairs and some other specific stuff we'll get into. Now, the book there, Bees of the World, was just embarrassingly made a cover. They made a cover for it with a fly on it. Thankfully, in the second edition, they did put a bumblebee on the cover. So it can be confusing. What actually is a bee anyway? Because a lot of insects look sort of like what we think a bee looks like. So those key characteristics of bees that separate them from other things, I mentioned branched hairs. So that's a scanning electron micrograph of the hairs there in the middle. Somewhere on the body, you'll find actual feather-like hairs, and you can see them with a hand lens or under a microscope. They're really cool. They're probably adapted for carrying pollen. The branches help the pollen stick with electrostatic energy, right? The use of pollen as a protein source is the key adaptation that makes a bee a bee. They're vegetarians. They do not eat animal protein, with a few weird exceptions. So all of that food, all that protein has to come from plants, right? And as I said earlier, they have adaptations for carrying pollen, like this bee in the lower left, which is carrying her pollen on the underside of her abdomen. That's not a bumblebee. And then bees generally have long tongues for extracting nectar from flowers. And I mean long relative to wasps, ants, flies, other insects that might look similar. So yes, let's move right along. So let's assume that you are able to determine it is a bee. And now we want to know, is it a bumblebee or is it some other kind of bee? So for these first two decision places, we do have a list of other resources here that might help you figure out, is it a bee, is it something else, and then specifically, is it a bumblebee? So bumblebees look similar to a bunch of other bees in California. Here's a roundup of 4 genera of bees that look similar to bumblebees. They're robust and hairy and sometimes colorful. And we often hear people say, oh, I saw this bumblebee and it was one of these instead. So we have oil bees, the genus Centris. These are super cool bees that visit plants in California that, in addition to making nectar and pollen, they also make oil, and the bee collects the oil and feeds it to their offspring. wonderful little system. Carpenter bees, which are really common in urban and suburban areas, so most people are familiar with them. They're usually black, but sometimes bright orange. Honeybees, we talked about earlier, they're a bit smaller, but sometimes people will mistake one for a bumblebee. And then this thing called anthophora, they're really common in California. They tend to have stripy abdomens, and they do look a bit like a bumblebee. Uh, Everybody except the honeybee on this page has they don't have a pollen basket. They have a brush of hairs in the same place. And so that's like a taxonomic difference. And that is one thing you can notice easily with experience. Those bees, you can see this big fluffy comb of hairs on the hind leg. They pack the pollen into that. And it's different from the way honeybees and bumblebees do it with the pollen basket. But that's one thing to look for. So bumblebees, they are large in size and hairy. They're often black and yellow in coloration in California, but expect other colors like orange, brown, and red, and white. They have that pollen basket. These are the key things to look for on bumblebees. Let's assume that we got to bumblebee, and now we want to separate males from females. This is hard at first, but it is really not hard. Once you've looked at a few bumblebees, you're going to start to see it right away. You're going to start to see males on flowers, and you won't even have to handle them to know it's a male. I promise you, if you pay attention, this is actually one of the easy distinctions. There's a bunch of different stuff. So in the blue there, males versus females. So males have 7 abdominal segments. They have no pollen basket. They have longer antenna and actually an extra segment, 13 versus 12. They have no stinger. So if you look at their butt, it's kind of flattened and there's no pointy tip, and there's certainly no stinger sticking out behind the pointy tip. Oh, I got an advance there I didn't expect. Males are often shaggier and sometimes have much larger eyes than their female counterparts. Their color patterns can be identical or can be quite different. This is Bombus griseocaulis, or brown-belted bumblebee, which you can only see in California in the northern and eastern parts of the state. It's widespread elsewhere. So let's imagine that we now know it's a male or it's a female. The only other decision we have to make before getting to species is it one of the cuckoos or is it not one of the cuckoos? So this should be easy with females, right? Because we know that the cuckoo females don't have the pollen basket. But what about the males? That's a little trickier. So here are the 4 states of the hind leg for males and females of cuckoos and non-cuckoos. Cuckoo means Cytherus, or Cytherus means cuckoo in this sense. So for the male cuckoos, they have a narrow bassotarsus, the hind leg, or sorry, the tibia where the pollen is carried. It's narrow, it's convex, so it's kind of comes out towards you. It's often not shiny and pitted with these little bumps. It's rugose, if you know that word from botany or similar. Males that are not cuckoo bumblebees, they don't have a pollen basket either, but they have a little bit more of a wider leg part like that. And you can see that they have some of those bristles on the sides of the leg, just a little shiny hairless area in the middle, but not very much. They are not capable of carrying pollen, but you can see that it's sort of going towards what the female's leg looks like. Here's the female cuckoo. Now they have a somewhat expanded hind leg right there, but there is no pollen basket. It can be a little shiny, but it's also going to be bumpy throughout. And the hairs on the sides do not arc over the top. And they could try, but I don't think they could carry pollen on that thing. And then, sorry, the photo quality is not great, but here's a female non-cuckoo, and you can see the shiny hairless area. It's concave, actually, partially, and it has really long bristles on the sides. So that concludes our really basic study of, is it a bee or not, and which bee is it, right? Now we're going to talk a little bit about identifying species of bumblebees. And because of time, which is running down quickly, I'm only going to talk about the 4 that are rare and currently protected by the California Endangered Species Act as candidates for listing. And I'll talk about some of their lookalikes. And I'll go as quickly as I can to try to end this on time. This is a simplified ID. Oh no, this is a simplified ID card that I made that you can find on the website in the project resources tab. And it's not adequate for all species identification. It's only for females, but it'll get you to the right group. So I've grouped them in these gross color pattern groups, like they have red on the body somewhere, or they have black and yellow on the body, but the first abdominal segment is yellow or it's black, and so on. So you can use that to get close. These things are in the wrong place. Sorry. Um, so uh, you can also use all sorts of other resources to identify these bumblebees to species. There's a Bumblebees in North America field guide that I happen to be a co-author on. Not telling you to buy it, but it is an option. There's a free Bumblebees of Western North America that I'm a co-author on that you can download from the Forest Service or from Xerces. Go find it. It's a little pamphlet, but it's great. It'll be and it's free. And then there's some other resources as well, especially online resources like iNaturalist, Bumblebee Watch, and Bumblebee Atlas. Okay, so our first rare species that we really need to think about, this is Bombus franklini. This is one I have never seen alive, and I bet Katie hasn't either because no one has seen it alive since 2006. It is possibly the rarest bumblebee in North America, could even be extinct already, but it is historically from the northern counties there, Trinity Alps, Marble Mountain Wilderness, and as far north as just a little bit farther than Mount Ashland in Oregon, tiny little range. It is mostly black with yellow hair around the face and front of the thorax and a little yellow hair at the end of the tail. So so in particular, you're going to look at the yellow on the thorax, and you can see there's that little horseshoe shape of black right on the top. It's not a complete black circle, but it's like a little horseshoe shape, and the yellow hair on the sides of it extends back on the thorax past where the wings attach. And that's the main characteristic to look for. It has pale hair at the tip of the tail, but only just a little bit. And I'm going to use these purple arrows to explain better. And importantly, it has a short cheek. So sometimes we aren't sure it's this bee or it's the common Vosnesensky bumblebee, for example, and we're going to want to look at that cheek to see what the shape and size of it is. Here are, I'm going to go through some lookalikes for that bee. One of them is also rare and on that list of 4. So the western bumblebee, Bombus occidentalis, this one is not currently protected by the federal ESA, but it is a candidate that has been assessed. And I don't work for the Fish and Wildlife Service, but I can tell you that of all the bumblebees they've considered for listing, this one is probably the one that warrants it most, excepting Franklin's. So if decisions are made based on biology, this will get listed at some point. It's definitely declining in California. The range map that shows a historic period and then a recent period, you can see how uncommon it is now in California. And I need to update those range maps. It's apparently gone from all of the California coast, which is a place that used to be very common. So if you feel like going to the beaches and looking for bumblebees, starting around Monterey Bay and going north, do it. If you find this bee there, we will be very excited. Okay, so, oh, sorry, the arrows. So this is another short-cheeked bee with black in the middle of the thorax. It usually is mostly black at the start of the abdomen, so T1, but it can have some yellow there, as you can see in the diagrams. And then it always has pale hair at the tip of the tail. It's almost always white, but in California, it can be pinkish, salmon, yellowy, dingy white, like this particular bee is. And so it can fool us a little bit. There are some lookalikes that are not white, but have a similar color like that there. Okay, so these are 3 species that can be confused for the prior 2. They're all closely related, and we call them yellow-faced bumblebees. The first one, Calagenosis or fog belt bumblebee, is uncommon in the state, and we're trying to find out if it's declining. It's found only right along the coast and in the coast ranges. The other 2 are real common. So Van Dyke's or Van Dykii and Vosnesensky's bumblebee or Bombus vosnesenskyii, you can see the range map there for the 3. They have, the first one is mainly on the coast, but the other 2 broadly overlap each other in different parts of the state. So depending on where you are, to distinguish these guys, you need to know where in the state you are. But you can see how these look a lot like the Western bumblebee and the Franklin's bumblebee in terms of being mostly black with some yellow on the head, yellow on the thorax, and then yellow towards the distal end of the abdomen. So the gross morphology, the sort of picture of the bee flying by, could be any of those 5 at this point. Unfortunately, this is a common look for bumblebees in California. So here's one that is not rare whatsoever in California. It may be declining elsewhere in its range. I should say it is declining on the East Coast. In California, this thing looks just like the ones we've just looked at. It's mainly black, yellow thorax, yellow stripe at the back of the abdomen on T4, the 4th abdominal segment. However, this bee is a little different. She has a really long tongue, which you can only partially see in this picture. Sorry, really long cheek, just really long, and a long tongue to go with it. Black hair on the head, so black face and black vertex. And those other bees we just looked at, there's yet partial or entire yellow hair color in those places. This bee is so it's there's the arrow for the cheek. So this bee is going to look very much like some of the others. However, once you start looking at the face and the length of the cheek, you'll see it is just completely different, and it becomes a pretty easy bee to identify. Hard at first, and then quite easy as you move forward. If you see this bee in northeastern California, it may be mostly yellow, like the graph, the diagrams to the left here. And that's the look of the bee throughout the rest of its range. So California, it's kind of special, and it actually used to have its own species name, Bombus californicus. Taxonomists are still arguing about which name to use for our bees in California. Here's another that's uncommon, but not of conservation concern yet. It's found only along the coast. All the dots in Central California on this map, I'm sorry, are wrong. Um, it occurs from about the Bay Area north, just near the beaches. It's a beautiful bee. It's very dingy in color, sort of a mix of yellow and dark hairs. So specifically, let's go from the front to the back. This bee has a slightly longer than wide cheek, so just a little bit longer, but noticeably so. It has black hair mixed into a yellow band on the front of the thorax, which you can plainly see in this image. It has yellow on the first two abdominal segments, although you can see from the diagrams that sometimes there's a little black mixed in there. And then at the tip of the tail, there's a lot of light hair, and it's usually kind of this salmon color, a little light pink. Sometimes it's dingy yellow. It can even be white. Um, Oh, one other thing, importantly, this bee has a lot of black hair at the end of the thorax. So you can see there isn't much yellow hair at the back end of the thorax. It's just black there. That's a little unusual for California's bumblebee species, and that helps us identify that one. Okay, so leaving behind Franklini and Occidentalis and their lookalikes, let's talk about Crotch's bumblebee, the one you're probably most familiar with because of its well, the fact that it's currently protected, and we're waiting to find out if it's rare enough to get listed. This bee has short hair. It has a short cheek. It is a beautiful animal. It's really big, and about 3/4 of them have red tails, and so it's just a striking animal when you see it. You can't miss it. It has a short cheek. It always has some yellow at the top of the head on the vertex there, mixed in with black or not. It has a black top of the thorax. It has usually has a black T1, but it can have yellow on the sides of T1 as indicated in the little graphics. And then the tip of the tail, as I said, usually red, but sometimes black. So this bee looks quite a bit different from the ones we've covered so far, but it does have some lookalikes. Oh, and it's really cool because it is nearly endemic in California. 99.9% of all records in history have come from the state of California. There's one from Oregon, one from Nevada, and 15 to 20 from Baja California. So this one can look similar to Crotch's. It has a wide array of different color patterns. We call it red-belted bumblebee because it often has red on its abdomen, but not always. Bombus rufus cinctus, that means red, red belted, I think. You can see the range there. It's mainly in the Sierras and the northern mountains, but there is a population in the Bay Area, and the population in the Bay Area is different. It looks a lot like the first ones we looked at, the Western bumblebee and Franklin's. There, I've circled it in a black rectangle there. I mean, you can see the gross color pattern is just very similar to those guys. So in the Bay Area, you're going to be looking for this bee looking a little bit like all the others we've covered so far. It has a short cheek. It almost always has a nice oval of black hair on the back, despite what you see in the graphics. And then the abdomen is so variable, but the middle of T2, the second abdominal segment, is almost always yellow, as you can see in the graphics. So with time, you'll get comfortable with this one, and it's not super hard to identify. But at first, it is so variable in its color pattern that it can look similar to many of the others. Here's another one that can look strikingly similar to Crotch's bumblebee, or quite different. So it's a large, robust, beautiful bee with short hair, like Crotch's. It has a long cheek, not a short cheek. So that's the first thing to look for. If the cheek is long, it's not Crotch's. It has black facial hair and black vertex hair with a few rare exceptions. So that's different from Crotch's. It usually has a black spot on the top of the thorax and then usually 3 abdominal segments of yellow followed by black. In Humboldt County and on San Miguel Island and nowhere else on Earth, they look just like Crotch's bumblebee. And there I've put a red rectangle around those images. It is indistinguishable except for the cheek and the vertex. So here you're going to need to see the cheek, and you're also going to need to know the hair color of the vertex. So remember what Katie said about photography, that comes into play here. I couldn't identify this bee from this photo alone because I can't see the cheek. Okay, the last of the 4 that are candidates for listing in California is Bombus sucklei. This is one of the cuckoos. It is a host specialist. It only uses Western bumblebee as a host, and perhaps Franklin, and maybe 1 or 2 others that are closely related that don't occur in California. So it's restricted in its host use, and that makes it especially vulnerable to declines. It's super rare. There are only 4 or 5 observations ever made in California, and it hasn't been seen in continental US for almost roughly 20 years. That's probably gone from California. It's not extinct. It's common in central Western Canada. So this bee will have black facial hair. It will have yellow on the sides of the thorax. That's important. Most of the cuckoo bumblebees don't have yellow on the side of the thorax. If you see a lot of yellow under the wing and you know it's a cuckoo and it's female, you can get excited, and maybe it's this one. It has a yellow stripe on T4, and that yellow stripe is usually not broken by black in the middle, as you can see in 4 of the 5 image graphics. And that distinguishes it from this one. Sorry about the title there. This is Bombus insularis, or indiscriminate cuckoo bumblebee. This one can look a lot like Suckly's, but if you've decided it is a cuckoo, look at the abdomen where the arrow is pointing, and on T4 there, it also has yellow hair, but that yellow hair is almost always divided by black right down the middle. Even better, this one always has yellow hair on the face. So see that yellow hair just above where the antennae are attaching? That's diagnostic for this guy. If you know it's a cuckoo and you're in California and you can find yellow hair on the face, you're done, if it's female. So none of the other ones have yellow facial hair, and that's a really good characteristic to use for this one. This is a common species. It uses lots of hosts, very common in the southern Sierras. It's just incredible. It's almost as common as some of the really common non-cuckoo bumblebees. And that's it. We are out of time. And in fact, we're way out of time. I'm sorry for having gone over. What I'm going to do about questions that I didn't answer, that Katie and I didn't answer, is I'm going to type up responses to those, and I will be mailing you a document that has all those responses in the coming days. So sorry we don't have more time. Thank you so much for being here. I'm really excited that so many of you are here tonight and that you're going to participate. Please get in touch if you have any questions, and please come to an event. I look forward to meeting you. Katie, thank you so much for joining us and helping.
Yeah, thanks everyone for joining us here tonight. Good crowd.
All right. Have a good night, everyone.